Here's a screencast for you about the cultural context for Xala, this African novel that we're reading. And just a little introductory comment. I chose this novel because it was identified in a lot of sources that I looked at as a satire. As a reading experience, the reading experience of Xala, I don't know if it comes across as comical. I've also watched the film, and the image you see there is a still image from the opening credits of the film. I recommend watching the film if you're interested, because it's always interesting, I think, to see how a novel is adapted into film. And it was adapted by the author, who was also a filmmaker. So I believe he wrote the script and directed the adaptation. It's from 1970s Africa, so it might seem old-fashioned and, of course, foreign, but it's got subtitles and so on. So I recommend it if you're curious. It's maybe not, and generally not considered to be a great film, but a very interesting cultural artifact. And so, cultural context, we'll start with sort of, geography. So in general, this PowerPoint focuses on post-colonial Senegal. But this map of Africa, the African continent, shows you Senegal's location there. It's obviously the westernmost African nation. It's considered to be part of a region of Africa that's often called Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm sorry for that low-quality image, but it shows you the outline of that region. So that's not a nation, that's just this region known as Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, French-speaking Africa south of the Sahara. And so it includes, what looks like about a third of a very large continent. The other nations that are part of Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa are Mauritania, Guinea, Mali, the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Niger, Benin, Chad, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Gabon, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and Zaire. The next slide will show some more detail of Senegal. Obviously, the novel's set entirely in Senegal, and so Dakar, you can see, is on this westernmost point, and it's a bit hard to see, but this little blue word here is Gori, so that Gori Island, which is visited in the novel, is right off of Dakar. Gori Island, and Gambia is this region here, and that comes up in the novel, also called the Gambia. Let's see, I lost my place here. Here we go. So let me tell you some details of the history of Senegal, of post-colonial Senegal. As you can see, it was a French colony for quite a long period of time. In 1960, Senegal gained its independence from France. And that's that post-World War II era. Through the 60s and 70s is when many African nations gained their independence from their colonial powers. Gori Island, just off Dakar, was a departure point for millions of slaves bound for the New World. And you can see by its geographic location, it was the westernmost point. And so it became this departure point. So it had Gori Island has a sobering history, I guess you could say. For that region in general, of which Senegal is a part, that sub-Saharan Francophone region, it experienced a 20-year economic boom following World War II. From the end of World War II in 1945 until about 1965, there was a big economic boom that benefited the region. Between 1965 and 1985, the prices of agricultural products from the region, such as coffee, peanuts, timber, and cocoa, fell. The prices fell. And so those are, those are the sort of economic engines for the region. And so that boom ended as prices declined. At the same time, between 65 and 1985, the cost of imported industrial products rose. And so, profit margins fell and so on and so forth. There were also bad droughts, one from 67 to 74, and that coincided in part with the oil crisis. So that was an unhealthy time economically. And there was also a bad drought from 1979 to 1985. During this period, this post-colonial period in Senegal and generally throughout Africa, classes emerged. The working class, the middle class, and the elite classes emerged. Cities mushroomed in size during the economic boom from 45 to 65. And so there was some, sort of social stratification of nations like Senegal, although the impoverished peasant class remained by far the largest class. During this period, pervasive Western influence, during the period after independence, so after 1960, Western influence became pervasive, and that's important for Xala, for this novel. I'll get to that in a minute and point out some of the places in the novel where that cultural context intrudes or emerges. And so Western influence in clothing, music and instruments, language, the naming of children. Do you give your, if your African nation has achieved independence and is experiencing economic growth, do you name your child, give your child a Western name or a more traditional African name? And so this spread of Western influence in various ways led to conflict over using Western tools, so to speak, would help create and establish a new African cultural identity, or whether doing those things undermined traditional African cultural identity. Even now today, Africa is known for tribal conflict. If you know what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s, the genocide, which came out of tribal conflict, two main tribes in Rwanda. You know about tribal conflict. But actually tribal conflict in Africa, according to a source that I read, is relatively new. The French, and especially the Belgian occupiers Belgian occupiers would be Francophone occupiers, right? French-speaking. The French and Belgian occupiers emphasized tribal identity of, their colonial subjects during the colonial period. So, for example, identification papers would include identification of someone's tribe and so on. And after independence, aspiring politicians found they could get votes by emphasizing tribal identity. Xala, the novel is more about social than tribal conflict, but still that's an important part of the context in which it's written and takes place. I want to point out, a few places in the beginning of the novel where you can see some of these conflicts coming to the foreground. The way the novel begins, pages 1 and 2, is really about this whole political context, historical context, and cultural conflict. The businessmen, this is the first paragraph, the quote-unquote businessmen had met to mark the day with a celebration worthy of the event. Never before in the history of Senegal had the Chamber of Commerce and Industry been headed by an African. This is in 1974. And so the novel begins with this moment where for the first time an African is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Presumably, it had been Westerners prior to that, probably French. For the first time, a Senegalese occupied the president's seat. It was their victory. For 10 long years, these enterprising men had struggled to capture this last bastion of the colonial era from their adversaries. And the second paragraph, is very much as well situated in the historical and political context of Senegal in 1974. They had come together from different sectors of the business communities to form the Businessmen's Group in order to combat the invasion of foreign interests. So there's that conflict over Western influence. It was their ambition to gain control of their country's economy. Their anxiety to constitute a social clan of their own had increased their combativity, tinging it with xenophobia. So they're trying to establish a social clan. Like I said, it's more social than tribal conflict that this novel's concerned with. Over the years, they had managed, with some help from the politicians, to obtain a foothold in the wholesale trade and to a lesser extent in the import and export field. They had become more ambitious, and so on. Blah, 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 looking at... Anyway, so he situates the very beginning of the novel in the context of this social conflict in the sort of post-colonial conflict with, ousting Westerners and installing Africans and so on. On page 2, it's an important note in the first full paragraph on paragraph 2, in page 2, the group's president pauses in his speech and he looks around the room at 10 or so expensively dressed men. The cut of their made-to-measure suits and their immaculate shirts were ample evidence of their success. In other words, and if you see the movie, you see this is even more evident, they're dressed in Western business garb, right? They're wearing Western suits and ties and shirts and jackets and so on. So these men have very much bought into the Western influencer and in favor of it. The next paragraph mentions, since the beginning of the foreign occupation, no African has ever been president of the chamber. The beginning of the foreign occupation, that's going back to 1677. The end of that paragraph mentions difficult times. 1974 was the end of a 7-year drought. It was a period of energy crisis in the U.S. and elsewhere. And he says explicitly, 2/3 of the way down the page, as president of the Chamber of Commerce is giving his speech, although we are anxious to belong to the modern world, we haven't abandoned our African customs. So that's a typical classic African dilemma, trying to preserve customs while at the same time entering the modern westernized world. I thought it was interesting also on page 17 at a wedding. There's literally a conflict, almost a war between an amplified, westernized band playing modern music. On page 17, they could hear the band playing modern music from some way off, because that band is amplified in typical Western style. Under the veranda, a kora player with 2 women accompanists took advantage of breaks in the band's playing to show what he could do, singing at the top of his voice. So the traditional African music is competing with the amplified Western music and having to, insert itself between songs. The kora that he's playing, by the way, was a 21-stringed instrument similar to a lute. Anyway, so and those are not the only places where there's conflict between modern and traditional Africa. It's also interesting to note that the author often notes the language in which people speak. He tells you which language they use when they speak, because that signals their cultural loyalties, whether it's to Islam, and we'll talk about Islam momentarily, or to Africa, or to, a more global, westernized thing. Politics, just briefly, politics in Senegal. Senegal is a liberal democracy. It has a president, a prime minister, a parliament, and a judiciary. It's one of the few African states never to have had a coup d'etat. And so its transition to independence was relatively peaceful. Its government since then has been stable and hasn't been overthrown, and that's not true in a lot of African nations. It has a lot of political parties. Its presidents have generally served lengthy terms. It has had low levels of corruption compared to other African nations, and so it's a relatively stable nation, politically speaking. Again, just briefly, the arts in Senegal, we get a taste of that with the kora player, that 21-stringed instrument, on page 17, if you want to look at that again. But also, most common in Senegal has been the social realism movement. We talked about social realism with Closely Watched Trains, right? So social realism is realism that makes commentary on social conditions, and it's especially sympathetic to the working class and to the impoverished, and generally hostile to wealth and to government. So that's been the trend in the arts in Senegal. Religion, obviously, is significant in Xala. It's about religion in a lot of ways, and so to let you know the religious context of the novel, in Senegal, Senegal is 94% Muslim and 4% Christian, 2% indigenous religions, which vary from, cover the sort of spectrum from animism to fetishism and combine those things. The main characters obviously are Islamic, although the main character's first wife is a former Catholic. When he visits a seer, the Sitkat, he visits a seer in the novel. That is an example of the indigenous animism and fetishism. So animism attributes powers to animals and plants, and it's evident in the hut decorations when he goes to see the Sitkat, the seer. Fetishism attributes powers to inanimate objects, and so, for example, the cowrie shells that the seer uses in divination. We're talking about divination for the second time this semester. Divination was something we talked about with the golden ass. So it might be good to look at page 48 when he goes to see the seer, and the seer sees him, the Sitkat, because that indigenous animism and fetishism is quite evident. So if you look at page 48, they go to the seer's hut. A sack, I'm looking at the very top of 48, a sack served as the door. On the inside of the enclosure, the quote-unquote door had been dyed red, and animal teeth, cat's paws, birds' beaks, shriveled skins, and amulets had been sewn onto it. An assortment of bizarre-shaped animal horns lay in a circle around the sides of the enclosure. The ground was covered in fine, clean sand. All these animal parts, is that animism or fetishism? I mean, the animal, the cat's paws and horns and so on are sort of fetishistic objects, but of course they're pieces of animals, so the line between animism and fetishism is a gray area, maybe. And then in the second half of page 48, "Take these and breathe over them," ordered the Sitkat, addressing them for the first time. And he gives El Hadji cowrie shells. seashells, small seashells. If you look up cowrie shell, if you're not sure what it looks like, you'll immediately recognize that it's a popular decorative shell, even in Western jewelry and so on. Take these and breathe over them. El-Hadji held the cowries in the palm of his hand and murmured a few words. He breathed over the cowries and gave them back to the seat cot. The latter closed his eyes, muttering to himself in concentration. Then, with a guttural roar, he flung the cowries onto the piece of cloth. Divination. Sort of animistic, fetishistic divination. I think that's kind of interesting. Okay, so we should talk about Islam, though, because Senegal is a Muslim country. The main character is Islamic. And so it's very significant. Islam. So the 5 pillars of Islam. One is belief and witness, which means believe in Allah and in Muhammad's messages. Tell others of Islam, but do not coerce them. So be a witness to Islam, but don't coerce others to convert. Daily prayers. That's the second pillar of Islam. Devout Muslims pray 5 times a day, every day. First, performing ablutions with water or sand, washing the head and the hands and I think the feet, cleaning oneself before addressing Allah. They pray facing Mecca. They recite prayers and scripture while kneeling and bowing. There's no Sabbath day, or every day is a Sabbath day, perhaps. These 5 daily prayers occur every day of the week. Zakat means purity, and it has to do with tithing and alms. At the end of the year, a devout Muslim will give 2.5% of their wealth to those in need. And so under this pillar, zakat, which has to do with purity and charity, El-Hadji's treatment of the beggar is pretty harsh. Fasting is a pillar of Islam. It's obligatory during the month of Ramadan. From dawn to sunset, everyone who's past puberty and who isn't ill, menstruating, or nursing has no food, no drink, not even water, has no sex, doesn't smoke, from dawn to sunset during the month of Ramadan. The Muslim year is 354 days. Their calendar year is 354 days. And so that's why Ramadan gradually moves throughout the seasons. 10 years ago it may have been in autumn, and now it may be in winter, for example, because of the 354-day calendar. So when it's in summer, that's a special hardship. Obviously, it's difficult not to drink anything, even water, from dawn to sunset during the middle of summer. It's a special hardship, but it sort of bonds Muslims worldwide. The 5th pillar is Hajj, which is pilgrimage to Mecca. If at all possible, this pilgrimage should be taken once in someone's life, in a devout Muslim's life. Male pilgrims wear unsewn cloths that erase class distinctions. Pilgrims go to Mecca and walk 7 times around the Kaaba, which is a black stone cube 45 feet high. It's pretty interesting if you look for images or videos of that ritual. Pilgrims walking around this black stone cube, thousands of pilgrims swirling around this black stone cube, the Kaaba, which is said to be Adam's original place of worship. Adam's original place of worship. The first wife, El-Hadji's first wife, is a devout pilgrim. El-Hadji is portrayed essentially as a hypocritical Muslim. Jihad is not one of the 5 pillars, but of course it's a familiar notion, and it's an important notion in Islam. The West tends to think of jihad as holy war. Jihad literally means striving, and it refers to the struggle to defeat the lower self, quote unquote. Here's a quote from one of my sources. "The greater jihad is the internal fight between wrong and right, error and truth, selfishness and selflessness, hardness of heart and all-embracing love." So the greater jihad is an inner struggle for goodness, essentially. The lesser jihad is, quote, exerting effort to protect the way of God against the forces of evil. And so I suppose a holy war kind of jihad that we're perhaps familiar with is an example of the lesser jihad. And we, Westerners in general don't have the understanding that there's a greater jihad that jihad is not just about war. Last slide here telling you about Sembene Ousmane. And I've seen his name given in sources the other way around as Ousmane Sembene. So not sure what's up there, but I think obviously on the cover of our book he's identified as Sembene Ousmane. He was born in 1923, son of a fisherman. He died in 2007. He spoke French, Arabic, and a tribal language, Wolof, that comes up in the novel frequently. From 1938, when he was 15, until the early 1950s, he did manual labor in Africa and France. In fact, he fought for France in World War II. His first novel came out in 1956. He was a member of the Communist Party, considered himself a social realist. His early work especially focused on labor issues. It was sympathetic, of course, to the working class because it was social realism. He became and remained a leading African literary figure. In 1963, he began making films and became Africa's leading filmmaker. Okay, so I hope I've given you a good overview of the context in which the story of the novel occurs and in which the novel was written, and I hope that as you read it, you can see these religious and social and political and historical elements intruding into the novel and influencing the story and the characters and so on. Over and out.